Hey everyone, welcome to part one of the Civil Rights Movement. Our questions to think about: what were the origins of the Civil Rights Movement, and what were the major events of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s? Before we begin, I want to let you know that this is a much more streamlined version of the story of the Civil Rights Movement than I have done in the past, but we're just going to focus mostly on the major events of the African American Civil Rights Movement. When we take a look at the origins of the civil rights movement, most of this will look familiar since we've already talked about it. So these things are all coming together, and then that brings us into the moment of the early 1950s. So, beginning with the establishment of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, we mentioned that W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the co-founders of this organization in 1910. And one of the first things that the NAACP is going to do is to begin filing lawsuits against cities, businesses, educational institutions, all in an effort to fight segregation. And when it comes to educational desegregation, the NAACP is going to lead that charge. They're going to begin with graduate schools and then work into higher education and then finally make their way into K-12 elementary, secondary education. So that is one of our first origins of the civil rights movement. Next, we talked about the Harlem Renaissance. This is this period of social cultural rebirth within the African American community, centered in New York City, but it spreads throughout the country. It's also part of the New Negro movement of the 1920s. So I mentioned it before that building pride within a community is one of the first steps towards fighting for your rights. Third, we just mentioned the Double V campaign during World War II, and this is probably one of the most important foundations of the civil rights movement because it's right here in the immediate past. During the war, you had men who were drafted to fight against the fascism in Europe and yet struggled with the segregation, discrimination, and racism within the American military and within American society. So really nothing more than the Double V campaign has a serious impact on why the civil rights movement begins when it does, here in this moment. And then finally, the Cold War itself. So the Soviet Union is going to take advantage of its propaganda machine to embarrass the United States. One of the key phrases that you would often hear on the Soviet broadcasts were that the United States is the land of the free and the home of the brave, as long as you're white. Because if you're African American, you're going to face racism and discrimination. And this was hugely embarrassing for the United States, because if we think about the Cold War as this sort of deadly game of chess, it has a propaganda segment, and the Soviet Union has this powerful tool that criticizes the United States. So the United States is going to have to work within this negative image. Beginning our story here with the fight against segregation, many of you are familiar with the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case. And the goal of this particular case was to overturn the Supreme Court's earlier decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. We talked about this a while back, but the Plessy versus Ferguson case made the separate but equal doctrine valid. So the idea that you could require separate facilities for blacks and whites as long as those facilities were equal. Now, of course, what we've learned is that these facilities were never equal. I mean, there is just a stark contrast between the quality of white schools versus black schools throughout the American South. And what's interesting about the Brown case is that the NAACP doesn't necessarily build their case on the idea that these two schools are not equal. And the reason they didn't is because they didn't want Southern states to simply argue, oh yeah, we're going to be putting more money towards Black schools and therefore we can keep them separate. Instead, the NAACP is going to argue that just the sheer fact that these schools are separate makes Black students feel unequal, and that no amount of money could make that feeling go away. And in a close decision, 5-4, the Supreme Court agrees. As they put it, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place in public education. Immediately, there's a backlash. Over 100 Southern congressmen and senators sign a protest called the Southern Manifesto, where they're protesting the Supreme Court's decision. They argue that this goes against Southern tradition, this goes against Southern heritage, that nobody wants this, nobody Black or white wants this, and so they resist. The following year, the Supreme Court follows up with another announcement, and it's sometimes called the Brown 2 decision, a follow-up to the Brown case. And it's here that the Supreme Court probably makes their biggest mistake, because within the Brown 2 decision, the Supreme Court stated that schools must desegregate with, quote, all deliberate speed. But this gives the Southern states the opportunity to drag their feet. They're going to move as slowly as possible. By the end of 1956, in 6 Southern states, not a single Black child attended school with whites. So with all deliberate speed indeed. Moving into public desegregation, many of you, again, are familiar with the Montgomery bus boycott and the role of Rosa Parks. So like most Southern cities, Montgomery, Alabama had a segregated transportation system. And what this meant is that on the city buses, if you were Black, you had to sit in the back of the bus. There was some leeway for the fact that many more bus riders are Black than white. So if the Black section of the bus had filled up, African Americans were allowed to sit in the white section as long as no additional white passengers got on the bus. So the way the story goes is that on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, who was a 44-year-old Black seamstress, she gets on the bus and sits down in the white section. When additional white passengers get on the bus driver tells her to move to the back of the bus. And basically, to paraphrase what Rosa Parks said, she said, "I'm tired, I've been on my feet all day, I'm going to sit right here." And she was arrested for violating Montgomery's segregation laws. But there's a part of the story that's not often included, and that is the fact that Rosa Parks was the secretary of the local NAACP chapter, and they were looking for an opportunity to challenge the city's segregation laws. And so Rosa Parks's actions gives the NAACP that opportunity. In addition, there's going to be heavy involvement from local churches, and that's where Martin Luther King comes into the story. Martin Luther King Jr. was the minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, and this is where the boycott is going to be organized. And in 1955, Martin Luther King Jr. was just 26 years old. So this is remarkable in his young life at this point. So the decision is made that bus riders are going to boycott the bus system as protest. A boycott is a way to put economic pressure on an entity to make them change their policies. And because 75% of the bus riders in Montgomery were Black, the city would no longer be earning that revenue. So people found all sorts of creative ways not to ride the bus. They carpooled, they walked. They set up impromptu taxi services. And throughout the next year and change, the boycott really weighed heavily on the city of Montgomery. In the meantime, there is a court battle being fought. And when that case is successfully concluded, this is a huge moment in the civil rights movement because it is a legal victory, but it's also a symbolic victory in the sense that it gives people motivation. It gives them some inspiration. It revealed that African Americans did not need to wait around for their civil rights to be respected, that they could successfully demand them. And then the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, this organization was formed to keep the momentum of Montgomery going. And then finally here in 1957, we're back to school desegregation, this time in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is a really interesting story because it shows the ways in which the federal government is sort of trying to not be involved in the story of desegregation, but sort of finds that they're forced into it. In this situation, the Arkansas governor, Orville Faubus, was trying to prevent Black students from registering at the all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. But 9 Black students did register to desegregate this high school, 6 young women and 3 young men. When the first day of classes come, the students, the so-called Little Rock 9, are met with violent taunts and harassment. And Governor Faubus called in the National Guard to prevent the students from entering the building. We've mentioned it before, these great moments in presidential history. President Eisenhower is furious that Governor Faubus has used the National Guard to prevent these students from entering the building. So what President Eisenhower does in this fantastic moment is that he calls up the 101st Airborne to escort the students into the building. And in fact, members of the 101st would stay with the Little Rock 9 throughout the academic year to ensure their safety. But Arkansas is not quite done with their struggle. After the 1957-1958 school year, the district closes down Central High School to prevent its integration. And all of the white students end up going to these so-called academies, these private schools that didn't have to necessarily obey the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. Now, later, Central High School would be reopened, but really, by 1960, massive resistance to desegregation was confined to the Deep South. So coming back to our questions to think about, what were the origins of the civil rights movement? First, the establishment of the NAACP, then we have the Harlem Renaissance, then during World War II, we have the Double V campaign, and then finally in the post-war world, we have the Cold War itself. And then second, what were the major events of the civil rights movement in the 1950s? We started with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, and then the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School in 1957. So stay tuned for part 2 of the civil rights movement.